there, welcome to the English Pod community. I'm Blake, and I'm really excited to have you here today. Let me ask you a few questions before we dive into today's episode. Have you ever struggled to understand what people are saying in English? Or maybe you've tried to improve your English but aren't seeing the results you wanted? What if I told you that in just 30 days, you can make huge progress in your listening skills? In this episode, we'll talk about how I improved my English listening in 30 days and how you can do the same. By listening to real-life stories, you'll not only improve your listening, but also your writing skills. Because when you listen closely, you pick up on sentence structures, vocabulary, and how ideas flow. Let me tell you a quick story. A few years ago, I went on a trip to Spain. I was really excited to practice my Spanish, but what happened next was totally unexpected. I met a guy named Daniel at a cafe, and we started chatting. At first, I couldn't understand much of what he was saying because he spoke really quickly, and his accent was different. But instead of giving up, I decided to keep listening carefully. Every time I didn't understand, I asked him to slow down or explain it in a different way. Slowly but surely, I began to understand him better. One day, he told me about his experience learning English and how listening to real conversations made a huge difference for him. It hit me. That's exactly what I was missing. Just like him, I decided to focus on listening to everyday conversations instead of just studying grammar or vocabulary. Over the next few weeks, my listening improved dramatically. This experience made me realize that improving listening skills isn't about listening to boring language tapes or repeating phrases in isolation. It's about engaging with real people, hearing their stories, and practicing active listening. It's the same for your English. So, why don't we make today's episode your first step towards improving your English listening in 30 days? You'll get the chance to practice with some real-life stories, just like mine, and learn how to become a better listener. And remember, at the English Pod community, we upload videos every day to help you improve your English with topics just like this one. Now, let's dive into my journey and see how these little changes led to big results in just 30 days. Let's dive deeper into my journey of improving English listening in just 30 days. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Picture yourself sitting in a cafe, just like I did when I was listening. You hear people talking all around you, and their words sound like a blur. You catch a few words here and there, but the sentences move too fast. You want to join the conversation, but you're not sure if you'll understand what they say next. Has this ever happened to you? If so, you're not alone. When I first arrived in Spain, I was excited but also nervous. I had studied Spanish for months, but when I tried to listen to real people speaking, it felt impossible. I remember ordering coffee on my first day. The waiter asked me something and I froze. My mind was racing. Was he asking if I wanted sugar, milk, a different size? I had no idea. Instead of responding, I just smiled and nodded, hoping that whatever he asked wasn't too important. When he walked away, I felt frustrated with myself. Why was it so hard to understand spoken Spanish when I had studied the language so much? That moment made me realize something important. Studying words and grammar alone wasn't enough. I needed to train my ears to understand natural speech, just like a child learns their first language by listening before they start speaking. So, I made a plan. For the next 30 days, I would focus completely on improving my listening. I promised myself that I wouldn't give up, even when I felt confused or overwhelmed. And I'm glad I did, because what happened next changed everything. On the second day of my trip, I met a man named Daniel. He was a local, and we started talking because he was curious about where I was from. At first, I struggled to understand him. His words blended together. His accent was different from what I'd heard in Spanish classes. But instead of giving up, I decided to listen carefully rhythm of his speech, the way he connected words, and the common phrases he used. I even repeated some of his words in my head to get used to how they sounded. After a few minutes, something amazing happened. My brain started recognizing patterns. I still didn't understand every single word, but I got the general idea of what he was saying. Instead of panicking when I didn't understand, I asked him to repeat things or say them in a different way. He was happy to help, and our conversation kept going. That moment gave me so much confidence. I realized that listening wasn't just about knowing every word, it was about understanding the meaning behind the words. That night, I made a list of new words and phrases I had heard during our conversation. Instead of just memorizing them, I found real examples of how people use them in everyday life. I listened to short audio clips of native speakers and tried to guess the meaning of sentences before checking the translation. I also repeated sentences out loud, trying to copy the way native speakers spoke. This helped me connect listening with speaking, which made learning much easier. By the end of the first week, I noticed a huge change. I could understand more of what people were saying without needing to translate everything in my head. I could follow conversations more easily, even when people spoke quickly. Most importantly, I felt more confident. Before, I was afraid of making mistakes. But now, I understood that making mistakes was part of learning. The more I listened and practiced, the better I got. One of the biggest breakthroughs happened on day 15. I went back to the same cafe where I had struggled on my first day. This time, when the waiter spoke to me, I understood him right away. He asked if I wanted my coffee with sugar or without, and I answered naturally, without hesitation. It felt so good to finally communicate without fear. I wasn't just memorizing words anymore. I was actually using them in real life. This experience taught me some valuable lessons about learning a language. First, listening every day is the key to improving. Even if you only understand a little at first, your brain will start recognizing patterns over time. Second, real conversations are the best way to learn. Books and apps can help, but nothing beats listening to actual people speak. And finally, patience is important. At first, it might feel like you're not making progress, but if you keep going, you will see results. Now, I want you to think about your own experience with learning English. Have you ever felt frustrated when trying to understand native speakers? Have you ever wanted to join a conversation but held back because you weren't sure if you would understand? If so, I completely understand how you feel. But I promise, if you follow the right steps, you'll improve. Just like I did in Spanish, train your ears to understand English naturally. Let's dive even deeper into my experience and why listening every day makes such a big difference in your English learning process. If you're serious about improving your English listening skills, you're going to want to pay close attention because I'm about to share some personal stories, tips, and strategies that can help you make massive progress in just 30 days. Just like I did. When I first started learning English, I didn't have the luxury of studying in an English-speaking country like I did with Spanish in Spain. I didn't have that opportunity to practice with locals, hear the language in different contexts, or really immerse myself in everyday conversations. At first, I relied heavily on textbooks, apps, and grammar exercises. And although I learned a lot of rules, I found it difficult to understand what people were saying when I listened to natural English. It felt overwhelming. Have you ever felt that way when listening to English? You know the words, but the speed and rhythm of real conversations throw you off? I remember a specific moment in my early language learning journey. I was watching a life's popular TV show, and I thought I had mastered the vocabulary, so I decided to try and watch it without subtitles. But within the first few minutes, I realized how much I was missing. People were speaking quickly, and they used slang and phrases I had never learned. I felt frustrated and a little defeated. It was clear That's when I decided to change my approach. I knew I had to start listening to real-life conversations every day. Conversations that sounded like the ones I would have in my everyday life. No more textbook dialogues. No more controlled, slow speech. I needed the real stuff. I started by listening to podcasts like the one you're listening to now. I would listen to them in the morning while I made my coffee, on my way to work, and sometimes even while I cooked dinner. Even if I didn't understand everything, I didn't stop. I kept listening. At first, it was difficult. I didn't catch much, and I often had to rewind or ask myself questions like, what does that word mean? Or, what does this expression really mean in context? But I didn't let it discourage me. Every time I didn't understand something, I wrote it down and researched it later. Slowly, over time, I began to notice patterns in language. I started recognizing phrases that I had heard repeatedly and could guess their meanings based on the context. One example that stands out is a common phrase used by my friend Daniel when we were in Spain. He would say, "No worries, it's all good." At first, I had no idea what it meant, but after hearing it over and over, I understood it simply meant, "It's okay," or "Don't worry about it." What helped me the most during that time was focusing on context. When you listen to real-life conversations, the context is key. It's not just about hearing individual words, it's about understanding the meaning behind the words. That's where the magic happens. The more I listened to conversations and paid attention to the context, the more I understood. For example, Daniel used the phrase, "No worries, it's all good," whenever we were having fun or didn't need to worry about something. The context of our relaxed, friendly environment helped me understand what he meant. Even though the individual words weren't exactly familiar to me at first, by the third week of this experiment, I had started to notice real improvements. I was understanding conversations with much more ease. I could pick up on tone, mood, and body language, all of which made understanding spoken language so much clearer. It was incredible. I realized that language is so much more than just the words we use. It's about how we communicate feelings and ideas. Listening to real-life stories and conversations helped me understand English in a more natural, fluid way. I also started applying this technique in other areas of my life. For example, I watched movies in English without subtitles, not worrying if I didn't catch every single word. Instead of translating every word into my native language, I tried to understand the overall meaning of the sentence or the scene. This method allowed me to focus on the big picture of communication and helped me understand conversations better. One day, I was sitting in a coffee shop in the United States when I had a conversation with a native English speaker, a woman named Sarah. Sarah had been in the coffee shop for a while, working on her laptop. I noticed she was listening to an audio podcast, much like this one, and I couldn't help but be curious. So, I struck up a conversation with her. I asked what she was listening to, and we started talking about the power of listening and learning a new language. She told me that, just like me, she had been focusing on listening for the past month to improve her own language skills. She shared how listening to podcasts and watching TV shows helped her understand real-life English. Her story was so inspiring, and I realized that we were both on the same journey of improving our listening skills. In that conversation, something clicked for me. Sarah's English sounded so natural, and I could understand her perfectly because she was speaking at a normal speed. We both agreed that language learning is all about practice, especially practice that involves real-life situations. The more you listen to people speaking naturally, the more your brain starts to connect the dots. After that conversation, I felt more motivated than ever. I increased my listening time even more. I began listening to podcasts during my commute, at the gym, and even while doing household chores. I didn't just listen passively, I actively engaged with the content. For example, if I heard an interesting word or expression, I encourage you to listen to English every day for 30 days, but make sure you're listening to real conversations, whether it's podcasts, interviews, TV shows, or even everyday interactions. Try to listen to as much real-life English as possible. Don't worry if you don't understand everything at first. The important part is to stay consistent. Every day, take small steps to improve. Your progress will surprise you. The key is to be patient with yourself. Learning a language is a journey, not a race. Just like me, you'll see the benefits of listening every single day. You'll start noticing patterns in the language, your vocabulary will grow, and your confidence will skyrocket. Most importantly, you'll feel more connected to the language and the world around you. And that's when learning becomes truly fun and rewarding. Remember, here at the English Pod community, we're committed to helping you improve your English every day. We upload new episodes regularly, so there's always a chance to practice and learn something new. Stay tuned for more tips, real-life stories, and listening practice that can help you achieve your language learning goals. Keep listening, keep practicing, and you'll be amazed at how much you can improve. As I kept up with my listening practice, I noticed something really interesting happening. My brain started getting used to the rhythm and flow of the English language. At first, everything had sounded too fast, like a blur of words running together. But after listening every day, my ears adjusted. It was like tuning a radio. And at first, it's all static. But then suddenly, the voices become clear. One day, I was at a bookstore looking through some travel books when I overheard a conversation between two native English speakers. Normally, I would only catch a few words here and there, but this time, I understood almost everything they were saying. They were talking about an upcoming trip to Italy and discussing where they wanted to go. One of them said, "I can't wait to see the Colosseum in Rome. It's been on my bucket list for years." I immediately recognized the phrase bucket list, which means a list of things you want to do in your lifetime. Just a few weeks before, I wouldn't have known what that meant. But because I had heard it in podcasts and movies, I understood it instantly. That small moment gave me a huge confidence boost. It proved that listening every day was working. I was no longer just memorizing words. I was understanding how they were actually used in real conversations. I started noticing patterns in the way people spoke, how they used contractions like I'm instead of I am, and how they linked words together. For example, instead of saying, "What are you doing?" many native speakers say it quickly, as "What you doing?" These little details made a big difference in my understanding. Then, something even more exciting happened. I was at a cafe, and the waiter came up to take my order. Normally, I would feel nervous speaking English in a real situation. That day, I felt different. I had been listening to so many natural conversations that the words just came out, without even thinking too much. I ordered my coffee and made a little small talk with the waiter. It was a simple conversation, but it felt amazing because I was speaking naturally, without translating in my head. That was a huge moment for me, and that's when I realized listening and speaking are connected. The more you listen, the easier it is to speak. When you hear the same phrases and expressions again and again, they become part of your brain's memory. You don't have to think about grammar rules or translations. The words just come out naturally. This is why babies learn to speak before they learn to read or write. They listen for months before they ever say their first words. The same thing happens with adults learning a new language. Listening every day trains your brain to understand and produce the language naturally. After that cafe experience, I wanted to test myself even more. I decided to have a full conversation in English with my friend Daniel, who is a native speaker. Normally, when I spoke English, I felt a little shy or worried about making mistakes. But this time, I reminded myself that I had been listening to English for hours every day. I had heard so many conversations, so many different accents, and so many real-life situations. I told myself, talked about so many things: travel, work, food, and even funny stories from our childhoods. I noticed that I was speaking faster, using better expressions, and feeling more relaxed. Of course, I still made mistakes, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that I was communicating confidently. That was the moment I truly understood the power of listening. It wasn't just about understanding words. It was about gaining confidence, improving pronunciation, and feeling more comfortable in real conversations. At that point, I wanted to take my learning to the next level. I decided to listen to different types of English: news reports, audiobooks, interviews, and even stand-up comedy. Each type of listening gave me something new to learn. For example, when I listened to interviews, I learned how real conversations flow. I noticed that people interrupt each other sometimes, or they use filler words like "you know" and "I mean." This helped me understand the natural rhythm of English. When I listened to audiobooks, I improved my pronunciation because I could hear words clearly and repeat them. I would sometimes pause the audiobook and try to say the same sentence in the same way. It was like having a pronunciation coach right in my ears. And when I listened to comedy, I learned about humor and slang. I didn't always understand the jokes right away, but I didn't give up. I would look up the words I didn't know and try to understand why the joke was funny. Over time, I started getting it, and I felt even more connected to the language. One of my favorite moments was when I watched a stand-up comedy show and actually laughed at a joke before the subtitles even appeared. That was a huge achievement for me because it meant I understood English in real time without needing translations. So here's my advice for you. If you want to improve your listening, make it part of your daily life. Listen while you're cooking, while you're exercising, while you're commuting, anytime, anywhere. The more you surround yourself with English, the faster you'll improve. And don't worry if you don't understand everything at first. That's completely normal. The key is to keep listening. Your brain is learning even when you don't realize it. Now, let me share one last personal story that really proved to me how much I had improved. A few months after I started my listening routine, I traveled to New York. It was my first time in an English-speaking country, and I was both excited and nervous. On my first day there, I went to a small diner for breakfast. The waitress came up to me and spoke in a fast, casual way. "Hey there, how's it going? What can I get ya?" Before my listening practice, I would have frozen in panic. But this time, I understood her completely. I smiled and answered naturally. "I'm good, thanks. I'll have some pancakes and coffee, please." She nodded and said, "Sure thing. You want syrup with that?" Again, I understood instantly and replied, "Yes, please." That conversation may sound simple, but for me, it was a huge success. It showed me that all my listening practice had paid off. I wasn't just memorizing words, I was living the language. So, if you ever feel frustrated with listening, just remember this. Every time you listen, you're improving. Even if it feels slow, you are making progress. And one day, you'll find yourself in a real-life situation where everything just clicks. You'll realize how far you've come. Keep listening, keep practicing, and you'll be amazed at how much you improve. I know it's easy to get discouraged when you're learning a new language, especially with something as tricky as English. There are so many rules, so many words, and so many different accents and ways people speak. But trust me when I say that the journey is worth it. If you keep at it and focus on one thing, like listening, you'll see how quickly things move. language over and over again. As I continued to listen to different podcasts, my brain began to adjust. I started recognizing the familiar sounds, patterns, and words. Slowly but surely, I started understanding more and more. One day, I listened to a podcast episode about someone's trip to Japan. The host talked about visiting Tokyo, tasting sushi, and experiencing Japanese culture. Even though the host was speaking at a fast pace, I could understand most of what they were saying because I had heard similar words and phrases before. This was a breakthrough moment for me because it showed me that listening consistently helps you build knowledge and understanding over time. I still remember one of the most useful things I learned from that podcast. The host mentioned how Japanese people often bow when greeting each other, and I was surprised to hear that. I never really thought about the cultural differences in communication before. That little detail helped me see how language and culture are connected. As I listened to more podcasts, I started noticing more of these little cultural insights, and they made me feel more connected to the language. Listening didn't just help me understand the language better, but it also started to change how I thought about it. I started to appreciate the subtleties in how people speak. For example, when I heard someone say, "I've got a lot on my plate today," I learned that this doesn't just mean you have food on your plate. It's a way of saying you're busy. This kind of knowledge is something you can only gain through listening to real-life conversations. As I improved, I also began noticing how important context is when it comes to understanding English. One day, I was listening to a podcast about personal finance, and the host was discussing how important it is to save for retirement. They said, "It's never too early to start saving. Trust me, your future self will thank you." The word "trust me" was something I had heard before in many other contexts, but I hadn't really understood its full meaning until that moment. Now I realized that people use phrases like this to sound more friendly and reassuring. You see, when you listen to different topics and contexts, you start understanding the deeper meaning behind the words. You also begin to recognize which words are used in formal or informal settings. For example, the phrase, "It's never too early to start saving," is a more formal way of saying, "You should start saving now," in an everyday conversation. Listening helps you not only understand what words mean, but also how they're used in different situations. Then, something interesting happened. I started finding it easier to listen to English TV shows and movies. A while back, I tried watching an English movie with subtitles, and I was struggling to keep up. But now, after months of consistent listening practice, I could watch a movie without needing subtitles for everything. Sure, there were still some words I didn't know, but I was able to understand the plot and the jokes without much difficulty. This experience made me realize that listening to real-life conversations is different from just memorizing vocabulary or grammar rules. When you listen to natural speech, you start picking up on things like tone, pauses, and emphasis. For example, the way someone says, "Wow, that's amazing," can tell you a lot about how they feel, whether they're genuinely impressed or just being sarcastic. I also started recognizing the importance of understanding accents and dialects. In the beginning, I would often get confused by different English accents. For example, the first time I listened to an Australian podcast, I had a hard time understanding some of the words. But after listening more, I became familiar with the accent and could understand it more clearly. It was like learning a new version of English, and I realized that there are so many different ways to speak the language. So, when I was able to travel to the UK, I felt more prepared. I had practiced listening to different accents, and I wasn't as intimidated by the thought of speaking to a British person. In fact, I found myself chatting with the locals at a cafe without any stress at all. We talked about everything from the weather to their favorite football teams, and I realized how much I had improved. But here's something important to keep in mind. Listening isn't just about I remember when I was in a meeting at work, I had to listen carefully to a discussion about a project we were working on. There were several people speaking at once, and they used some technical terms that I wasn't familiar with. But because I had been listening to English for so long, I was able to catch enough of the conversation to understand what was going on. After the meeting, I felt really proud of myself. I had understood most of the discussion, even though some of the words were new to me. It was a big confidence boost because it showed me that listening practice was paying off in real-life situations. As I continued to practice, I also began paying more attention to how people use their voices to convey meaning. For example, I noticed that when people are excited, they tend to speak more quickly and with more energy. When they're sad, their voices become slower and more quiet. This is something you can pick up just by listening. You start understanding not only the words, but the emotions behind them. By this point, I was starting to feel more comfortable speaking English too. I realized that listening wasn't just about hearing the words. It was about training my brain to understand how language works in real situations. The more I listened, the easier it became to speak. I no longer had to search for the right words. I just knew what to say. So, here's another tip. Try to listen to different accents, different voices, and different topics. You'll learn a lot by hearing how people speak in different situations. Whether it's a casual conversation, a professional meeting, or a funny joke, each conversation helps you get one step closer to mastering the language. Listening to real life stories, like the ones I've shared with you today, can improve your understanding of how language works. You'll start noticing patterns, getting used to different accents, and understanding how context changes the meaning of words. The more you listen, the more you'll feel confident speaking English in your everyday life. Keep practicing, and soon you'll be amazed at how much you've learned just by listening. And trust me, when you can understand and speak English naturally, it opens up a whole new world of opportunities. So, stay motivated, keep going. You're making incredible progress, and I'm excited for you to see just how far you can go. As we continue to explore how listening improves your English skills, let me share some more personal experiences that really helped me see the power of listening. One thing I found really surprising was how much I learned about vocabulary simply by listening to real conversations. Sometimes you think you know a word, but when you hear it used in context, it takes on a whole new meaning. I'll give you an example. There's this word, broke. I always thought it just meant that someone didn't have any money. That's the simple textbook definition. But one day I was listening to a podcast about someone's trip to New York, and they said, I was completely broke after that shopping spree. This wasn't just about not having money. It meant that they had spent so much money on shopping that they had run out of funds. They weren't just describing their financial state. They were explaining the reason for it. This is a small example, but it's a great reminder of why listening to real conversations is so important. It's not just about learning isolated words. It's about learning how those words are used in different situations. When you hear the word broke in a different context, like in a business meeting where someone says, the company is broke, you start to realize it has more than one meaning depending on the situation. This is something you won't learn by just memorizing vocabulary lists. You have to listen to how people really use the language. As I got better at listening, I also started noticing how much tone plays a role in communication. You know, in English, the tone of your voice can completely change the meaning of what you're saying. I'm sure you've experienced this yourself. Think about when someone says, really? You can say it in so many ways. You can say it in a curious way, like, really? With your eyebrows raised, asking for more information. Or you could say it in a sarcastic way, like, really? With a roll of your eyes, implying that you don't believe what the other person is saying. When I first started listening stand out to me was the way he said, "It turns out." He didn't just say, "I got lost in Rome." He added, "It turns out," to explain that after some thinking, he realized he didn't know as much as he thought. These little phrases like "it turns out" or "as it turns out" are used so naturally in real conversations, but I would have never learned how to use them if I hadn't been listening to people talk. Over time, I started noticing even more useful phrases that I could use in my own speech. For example, when someone says "to be honest," they're often about to give their true opinion or feelings, even if it might be hard to hear. So, if you say, "To be honest, I didn't enjoy the movie," it's a way of being open and straightforward with the person you're talking to. It's a way of making your message clear and honest, which is something that I think is very important when learning any language. But it wasn't always easy. In fact, there were times when I felt frustrated because I couldn't understand everything I was hearing. One of the most challenging moments I remember was listening to an episode of a podcast where the host was talking about the stock market. I had no idea what they were saying because they used so many business terms I wasn't familiar with. They said things like bull market and bear market, which I had heard before but didn't really understand. Instead of giving up, I decided to do some research on these terms. I found out that a bull market is when the stock market is doing well, and a bear market is when it's doing poorly. Once I understood the meaning of those terms, I went back and listened to the podcast again. This time, I understood much more. I realized that by learning new words and phrases, I could improve my ability to understand more complex topics. This is something I want to highlight for you today. Learning English isn't always about understanding every single word. Sometimes it's about understanding the overall message. It's about learning how to use context to fill in the gaps. So, when you're listening to something in English and you don't understand the word, don't panic. Try to understand the sentence's overall meaning. With practice, you'll start noticing patterns and picking up new vocabulary. Another interesting moment happened when I was listening to a podcast about someone's childhood in the United States. The host talked about growing up in a small town and how they would go to the local diner for breakfast every Sunday. I was listening carefully to the details, and something that really stood out to me was how the host described the food. They didn't just say, "We had breakfast." They used a more vivid description, saying, "We'd sit down to steaming plates of pancakes with maple syrup dripping down the sides." This wasn't just a meal, it was an experience. And by listening to how the host described it, I felt like I was there with them. This taught me the importance of descriptive language. The more you listen to English, the more you start to pick up on ways to describe things vividly and creatively. Whether it's a place, a person, or an experience, the descriptions can make your speech much more engaging and interesting. I make an effort to use more descriptive language when I speak, and it makes my conversations more colorful and lively. But of course, it's not just about learning new words or phrases, it's about learning how to connect with people through language. I remember a story I heard on another podcast about a group of friends who traveled to different countries together. They shared stories about their adventures and the challenges they faced while traveling. It wasn't just about what they did, it was about how they connected with each other and communicated in different cultures. This made me realize that English isn't just a tool for communication, it's a way to build relationships and connect with others from different backgrounds. So, when you're listening to English, think about the connections you're making. Think about the people behind the words. Each podcast you listen to is an opportunity to learn more about how language brings people together. And as you listen to more and more stories, you'll start feeling like you're part of the conversation too. As I continued listening to podcasts, I noticed that my speaking skills also started to improve. At first, I was nervous about speaking because I thought I wasn't good enough. But after listening to so many different English speakers, I started feeling more confident. I learned how to speak more naturally by paying attention to the way rapid. These kinds of responses show that you're engaged and interested in the conversation. Listening helps you understand what's appropriate to say and how to say it in a way that sounds natural. Another thing that listening to real-life stories taught me was how to use humor in conversations. I remember listening to a podcast where the host was telling a funny story about getting lost in the city. The way they told the story was full of humor. They exaggerated things for comedic effect, and I could hear the laughter in their voice. I realized that humor is a huge part of communication. It helps break the ice and makes conversations more enjoyable. I started paying more attention to how humor works in English, and now I use it in my own conversations. Listening to real life. Stories like these has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my English learning journey. It's not just about memorizing vocabulary, it's about learning how language is used in real situations. So, if you ever feel stuck or frustrated, remember that you're learning more than just words. You're learning how to connect with people, how to share your thoughts, and how to be part of a conversation. As we continue exploring how listening can help improve your English, I want to tell you more about how understanding real-life situations has really shaped my journey. When I started listening to more authentic English content, I began noticing how much language is shaped by the situation. It's not just about using big words or complicated grammar. It's about how people communicate in everyday life. For example, I remember this one time when I was listening to a podcast about a guy talking about his trip to London. He shared a funny experience about trying to find his way to a famous landmark, the Big Ben. He said, "I must have asked at least 5 people for directions, and everyone gave me a different answer. By the time I finally got there, I was so lost. I felt like I was in a different city." Now, this isn't just a simple travel story. It's a great example of how people use everyday expressions and humor in real conversations. When he said, "I must have asked at least 5 people," he didn't just tell you he asked 5 people. He used must have to show that it was definitely more than just a few people. It's something I now use in my own conversations. If I want to say I've done something more than once, or I've been really busy, I might say I must have spoken to 20 people today. It's a more natural way to exaggerate a situation and make it sound real. This also made me realize how much we use our own experiences to connect with others. The host wasn't just telling a boring fact about his trip. He was sharing his feelings, how he was confused, lost, and frustrated. By listening to how he shared those emotions, I began to see how important it is to add personality to your language. It's not just about getting the right words, it's about how you see them. The story was not only about what happened, but how the guy felt. And that's what makes it interesting to listen to. Another great example happened when I was listening to a podcast about someone's experience at a wedding. The speaker said, "I went to this wedding last weekend, and let me tell you, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The couple was so in love, you could feel it in the air. The ceremony was beautiful, and everyone was crying. This wasn't just about the wedding, it was about the emotions involved." When the speaker said, "You could feel it in the air," they were giving us a strong mental image. This is what listening can teach you, how to make something vivid and engaging. For a while, I didn't know how to express emotions like that. I would simply say, "It was nice," or "It was beautiful." But after listening to that wedding story, I started using phrases like, "You could feel it in the air," or "The energy was amazing." These phrases don't just describe something, they help you see it in your mind. They help you feel it. And I learned that in real-life situations, these expressions are more powerful than just simple adjectives. I think that's the beauty of listening. You start to hear how people connect their words to their feelings, which makes the conversation come to life. I also remember listening to an interview with someone who had lived abroad how they missed home during their first year in a new country. They said, "At first, I was excited to be in a new place, but after a few months, I started to miss the little things, like the smell of fresh bread baking in the morning. I remember how that story made me feel nostalgic about my own home, even though it was about someone else's experience." That's the power of language. It's not just words on a page, it's about how those words make you feel. And listening to these stories helps you connect with the emotions behind the language. If you want to sound more natural when speaking English, you have to be able to describe how things make you feel. You can't just say, "I like this," or "it's good." Instead, you can say things like, "It made me feel happy," or "I felt like I was home again." It makes your speech more emotional, and another important thing I learned from listening to podcasts is how much we rely on context in conversations. I'll give you an example. There was a story about a guy who was describing his job. He said, "I work in an office with a lot of meetings. At first it was overwhelming, but now I know how to handle it." Now, this sentence might sound simple, but what struck me was the use of "handle it." This phrase isn't just about managing work, it's about dealing with challenges. When you use "handle" in a conversation, it gives the impression that you've learned to deal with something difficult, which is often what happens in everyday life. At first, I didn't know how to express myself like this, but as I listened to people talk about their struggles or successes, I realized how important it is to use the right words to show how you feel about something. Instead of just saying "it was hard," you can say "I had to handle a lot of things," or "it took some time to get used to it." These little shifts in language make your speech sound more natural and fluent. There's also a lot of value in listening to people tell stories about their hobbies and passions. One story I listened to was about someone who was obsessed with photography. They said, "Every weekend I spend hours walking around the city taking photos of anything that catches my eye. I don't even care if people think I'm strange. I love it." This was such a great example of how to express your passion for something. It wasn't just about the activity, it was about how it made the person feel. They didn't just say, "I like photography." They said, "I love it." And they went on to explain why. Learning how to express your passion is another key thing I picked up from listening. Whether you're talking about your favorite hobby, a book you just finished, or a new skill you're learning, it's important to show excitement and energy in your speech. Instead of saying, "I like playing football," you could say, "I'm really into football. I spend hours playing every week and I can't get enough of it." These little changes make your speech more dynamic and interesting. And let's not forget about the power of stories that make us laugh. There was a podcast episode about a comedian who was sharing funny moments from their life. One of the best stories was about their first time performing on stage. They said, "I was so nervous I forgot my own jokes, but I still managed to make the audience laugh by just being myself." The way they told the story was full of humor, and you could hear how much they enjoyed sharing the experience. This taught me how important it is to bring humor into conversations, even when you're talking about serious topics. Humor can make things lighter and more enjoyable, and it helps people connect with you on a personal level. Listening to these kinds of stories has really helped me not only improve my English, but also understand how to use language in a way that connects with people. And that's what I want to share with you today. As you listen more to these real-life stories and examples, you'll see that the language isn't just about rules or grammar. It's about connecting with others and sharing your own experiences in a way that feels natural and genuine. I think one of the most eye-opening things I discovered while listening to real stories is just how important it is to be able to share personal experiences in a way that others can relate to. And that's something you learn by really paying attention to how people talk about their own lives. There was this one podcast episode I listened to where I hit rock bottom. I had lost my job, my relationships were falling apart, and I didn't know what to do next. But after a lot of reflection, I made a decision to start fresh. I didn't know how it would go, but I decided to go for it. When I heard that, I didn't just hear someone sharing their personal story. I heard someone talking about the courage it takes to make a change. And that's what I want to share with you. Listening to real stories isn't just about hearing what people went through. It's about understanding how they processed those moments and what they did to overcome challenges. I found myself thinking, wow, that's something I could do too. It's these kinds of moments that teach us how to express ourselves. Better in English because they show us the kinds of phrases people use to talk about their struggles and triumphs. For example, when the speaker said, I hit rock bottom, I understood that they were talking about a very low point in their life, but they also showed resilience when they decided to start fresh. This is exactly how we speak in real life. We don't just give details. We share how we felt, what changed, and what we decided to do. It's these kinds of emotional expressions that add depth to conversations. That's why listening to real-life stories is so important for improving your English. The same goes for stories about success. I once listened to a story about a man who had started his own business from scratch. He said, I started with nothing. No money, no experience, and no connections. But I had an idea and a dream. I took it step by step. Faced a lot of failures, but kept pushing forward. Now, I'm running a successful company with hundreds of employees. Listening to that story taught me something valuable. Success doesn't just happen overnight. It's a process that involves hard work, setbacks, and a lot of determination. But what stood out to me was how he told the story. He didn't just say, I started a company. He said, I started with nothing, and I kept pushing forward. These phrases show the effort he put in and the struggle he went through. These are the kinds of expressions that make your language more powerful. When you're telling your own story, whether it's about starting a new job, moving to a new country, or learning a new skill, you want to capture those emotions. You want to show the highs and lows, the challenges and victories. That's how you engage your listeners and make them feel connected to your experience. In addition to success stories, I've also learned so much from listening to people talk about their everyday experiences. These stories might seem simple, but they are filled with language that we use all the time. For example, I heard a story about a woman who talked about her routine. She said, every morning I wake up at 6 a.m., make a cup of coffee, and go for a run. It's how I start my day, and it helps me clear my mind. I realized how powerful these small details are. When we talk about our routines, we're not just describing what we do. We're also showing our values and what's important to us. This story taught me how to share personal habits in a more natural and engaging way. Instead of just saying, I wake up early, I can say, I wake up at 6 a.m., make a cup of coffee, and go for a run. This gives the listener more information and helps them picture what I also started noticing how people use language to describe their emotions in different situations. One podcast episode featured someone explaining how they dealt with a stressful situation at work. They said, I had a huge presentation coming up, and I was really nervous. But instead of letting my nerves control me, I decided to take a deep breath, focus, and do my best. And you know what? It went better than I expected. This example helped me understand how we use language to talk about challenges. The speaker used, I was really nervous to express their anxiety, but then they used, I decided to take a deep breath to show how they took control of their emotions. That shift in language from expressing fear to showing confidence was really powerful. It taught me how to talk about my own emotions in different situations. For instance, I used to say, I'm nervous about my presentation. That's a shift in both language and attitude, and it's something you can practice in your own conversations. Listening to these kinds of stories can also help you understand how people use humor to deal with difficult situations. For example, I heard a story about someone who was caught in a rainstorm without an umbrella. They said, "I was drenched, looking like I just stepped out of a swimming pool, but the best part was seeing people look at me like I was the one who caused the rain." It was hilarious. Humor is such a great tool in language because it makes things feel lighter and more enjoyable. When you listen to how people tell funny stories, you start to pick up on the little details that make those stories funny. Or, for instance, instead of just saying, "It rained," the speaker added, "I look like I just stepped out of a swimming pool," which makes it more vivid and relatable. And the phrase, "looking like I was the one who caused the rain," adds humor to the situation. Now, I try to use humor in my own conversations, especially when things don't go as planned. For example, if I'm running late, I might say, "I'm already 10 minutes late, but I'm hoping I can still make it before they finish the meeting." This adds a little humor and makes the conversation feel more relaxed. It also makes it more engaging for the listener. Another example comes from a podcast where the speaker talked about their love for cooking. They said, "I've been trying to cook more lately, but I always end up burning something. The other day, I accidentally burned my breakfast, but I just laughed and made myself some cereal instead." What I loved about this story was the attitude the speaker had. They didn't let a small mistake ruin their day. They laughed about it and moved on. That's something we can all learn from. When things don't go perfectly, it's okay to laugh and find a way to fix it. The way the speaker told the story made it feel lighthearted. It reminded me that not everything has to be perfect, and that's what makes real conversations enjoyable, the imperfections. In all of these examples, I've learned something important about language. It's not just about what we say, it's about how we say it. When you listen to real-life stories, you start to hear the nuances in language. You hear how people express their feelings, their humor, and their experiences. You pick up on the small details that make a big difference in how we communicate. And this is why listening is so important. It's through listening to real conversations and stories that we learn how to express ourselves in ways that are both natural and engaging. You don't have to memorize vocabulary or study grammar rules to sound like a native speaker. Instead, focus on listening to how people talk about their own lives. Pay attention to the expressions they use, the emotions they convey, and the stories they tell. By listening more to real conversations, you'll start to hear how English is used in everyday life. You'll notice how people connect with each other through their stories, how they use humor to lighten the mood, and how they share their feelings and experiences. And when you start using those same expressions and phrases in your own conversations, you'll sound more confident, natural, and fluent. I think one of the most eye-opening things I discovered while listening to real stories was how important it is to be able to share personal experiences in a way that others can relate to. And that's something you learn by really paying attention to how people talk about their own lives. There was this one podcast episode I listened to where the speaker talked about a difficult period in their life. They said, "A few years ago, I hit rock bottom. I had lost my job, my relationships were falling apart, and I didn't know what to do next. But after a lot of reflection, I made a decision to start fresh. I didn't know how it would go, but I decided to go for it." When I heard that, I didn't just hear someone sharing their personal story. I heard someone talking about the courage it takes to make change. And that's what I want to share with you. Listening to real stories isn't just about hearing what people went through. It's about understanding how they processed those moments and what they did to overcome challenges. I found myself thinking, wow, that's something I can do too. teach us how to express ourselves better in English because they show us the kinds of phrases people use to talk about their struggles and triumphs. For example, when the speaker said, "I hit rock bottom," I understood that they were talking about a very low point in their life, but they also showed resilience with, "I decided to start fresh." This is exactly how we speak in real life. We don't just give details, we share how we felt, what changed, and what we decided to do. It's these kinds of emotional expressions that add depth to conversations. And that's why listening to real-life stories is so important for improving your English. The same goes for stories about success. I once listened to a story about a man who had started his own business from scratch. He said, "I started with nothing. No money, no experience, and no connections. But I had an idea and a dream. I took it step by step, faced a lot of failures, but kept pushing forward. Now, I'm running a successful company with hundreds of employees." Listening to that story taught me something valuable. Success doesn't just happen overnight. It's a process that involves hard work, setbacks, and a lot of determination. But what stood out to me was how he told the story. He didn't just say, "I started a company." He said, "I started with nothing, and I kept pushing forward." These phrases show the effort he put in and the struggle he went through. These are the kinds of expressions that make your language more powerful. If you're telling your own story, whether it's about starting a new job, moving to a new country, or learning a new skill, you want to capture those emotions. You want to show the highs and lows, the challenges and victories. That's how you engage your listeners and make them feel connected to your experience. In addition to success stories, I've also learned so much from listening to people talk about their everyday experiences. These stories might seem simple, but they are filled with language that we use all the time. For example, I heard a story about a woman who talked about her routine. She said, "Every morning I wake up at 6 a.m., make a cup of coffee, and go for a run. It's how I start my day, and it helps me clear my mind." I realized how powerful these small details are. When we talk about our routines, we're not just describing what we do. We're also showing our values and what's important to us. This story taught me how to share personal habits in a more natural and engaging way. Instead of just saying, "I wake up early," I could say, "I wake up at 6 a.m., make a cup of coffee, and go for a run." This gives the listener more information and helps them picture what your day looks like. I also started noticing how people use language to describe their emotions in different situations. One podcast episode featured someone explaining how they dealt with a stressful situation at work. They said, "I had a huge presentation coming up and I was really nervous. But instead of letting my nerves control me, I decided to take a deep breath, focus, and do my best. And you know what? It went better than I expected." This example helped me understand how we use language to talk about challenges. The speaker used, "I was really nervous," to express their anxiety, but then they used, "I decided to take a deep breath," to show how they took control of their emotions. That shift in language from expressing fear to showing confidence was really powerful. It taught me how to talk about my own emotions in different situations. One of the things I realized as I listened to more stories and conversations was how important context is in language. When you're learning English, it's easy to focus on individual words or grammar rules. But the real magic happens when you understand the situation behind the words. Let me give you an example. A few months ago, I heard a story from a woman who had just moved to a new country. She said, "I didn't know anyone, and at first I felt totally out of place. But then I started meeting people at work, and they showed me around. They took me to the local market where I tried some food I had never seen before. It was a strange experience, but by the end of the day, I felt more comfortable." What I learned from this story was that language is not just about words. It's about the experience you're having when you It was a strange experience, which gave me a deeper understanding of what she went through. But she also used positive language like, by the end of the day, I felt more comfortable, showing that her experience turned into something positive. This is how we learn how to talk about our own experiences. It's all about giving context to the words we use. When we listen to stories like this, we learn how people use phrases and expressions to describe their emotions and their journey. It's like being invited into their world. You hear how they change their tone when they talk about difficult moments, and how they express their relief or joy when things start to get better. These small shifts in language teach us how to make our own stories more interesting. For example, when I was learning English, I would often say things like, I feel nervous, or I was scared. But after listening to more stories, I started to realize that there are many ways to describe emotions more precisely. I could say, I felt my heart race, or I had butterflies in my stomach. These phrases paint a picture for the listener. They help convey the feeling in a way that's more vivid and engaging. It's these little things you pick up from real conversations that take your language to the next level. Another great lesson I learned from listening to real stories was how people deal with failure. This is something we all experience, but the way we talk about it can vary greatly. For instance, I once heard a speaker share a story about a time they had failed a big test. They said, I had studied so hard, but when the results came back, I had failed. I was devastated. But instead of quitting, I asked for help. I went to a tutor and worked with them every day for 2 weeks. The next time I took the test, I passed with flying colors. What stuck with me was how the speaker didn't just focus on the failure. They didn't say, I failed and that's it. They took ownership of their emotions by saying, I was devastated. But then they shifted to a more positive and proactive tone. Instead of quitting, I asked for help. This transition from failure to success is powerful because it shows resilience. It's a great example of how to express setbacks in a way that doesn't leave you feeling stuck. It teaches you how to show both vulnerability and strength in your language. From that story, I learned how to talk about my own failures in a more constructive way. I started saying, I didn't do as well as I hoped, but I didn't give up. I figured out what went wrong and worked to improve. That's much more engaging than just saying, I failed. It shows the process and the effort, which is what makes the story interesting to others. Real-life stories also help with vocabulary and sentence structure. I once listened to an interview with a man who had worked in different countries and cultures. He said, when I first moved abroad, I was nervous about communicating in English. I wasn't sure if people would understand me, and I didn't want to make mistakes. The more I spoke, the more confident I became. And soon, I realized that making mistakes was part of the process. In fact, some of my best conversations came from those mistakes. What I love about this story is the message it sends. Learning. A language is a journey, and mistakes are an essential part of that journey. He used phrases like I wasn't sure and I didn't want to make mistakes to show his fear, but then he used positive phrases like the more confident I became, and some of my best conversations came from those mistakes. These shifts in tone are what make the story so real and relatable. It's not just about grammar, it's about how you express your experiences and feelings. Listening to this made me realize that I could talk about my own language learning journey in a similar way. Instead of saying, I'm not good at speaking English, I started saying, I've made a lot of mistakes, but I'm getting better every day. Some of my best learning moments happened when I made mistakes and learned from them. This is how real conversations work. People share their challenges and their victories, and that's what makes the conversation meaningful. Now, let's talk about some simple but powerful ways to use language to connect with people. One of the things I've noticed in conversations is how people ask for help. There's us how to adapt our language to fit the moment. It helps us sound more natural in different settings. Another example comes from a conversation I heard between two friends. One of them had just gone on a trip, and they said, "I had the best time. I went to the beach every day and just relaxed. It was exactly what I needed to recharge." This was a simple conversation, but it taught me a lot about how to express happiness and satisfaction in English. The speaker didn't just say, "I went to the beach." They said, "I went to the beach every day and just relaxed," which makes it sound like a positive and refreshing experience. They also used exactly what I needed to recharge to show how the trip helped them feel better. These are the kinds of expressions that make your conversation feel more authentic. From this story, I learned how to express my own feelings of happiness and satisfaction in a more detailed way. Instead of just saying, "I had a good time," I now say, "I had the best time. I went hiking in the mountains and it was so peaceful. It was exactly what I needed to clear my head." This gives the listener more information and helps them connect with my experience. It also makes the conversation sound more natural. As you can see, listening to real-life stories teaches you not only how to talk about your experiences, but also how to understand others' feelings and perspectives. You learn the language they use, the way they express their emotions, and the little details that make a conversation interesting. Whether it's about travel, work, family, or hobbies, these real stories give us the tools to speak more naturally and confidently. And as I keep listening and reflecting on these stories, I've realized that every conversation, no matter how simple, has the potential to teach us something valuable. So, I encourage you to listen to as many real-life stories as you can. Pay attention to the way people speak, the phrases they use, and the emotions they express. It's through these stories that we improve our English and become more confident speakers. One of the best ways to learn English is by observing how people share their daily lives. Think about how often you hear someone say, "I'm busy today," or "I have a lot to do." It sounds simple, right? But when you start paying attention, you realize that these phrases are actually filled with meaning. For example, when a friend says, "I have a lot to do," it's not just about the tasks they have. They're also sharing their state of mind. They're telling you that they feel overwhelmed or that they've got a full schedule. This simple expression reveals a lot about someone's day. I remember a time when a colleague told me, "I had a long day at work. Everything was going wrong, and I was exhausted by the time I got home." Now, let's break this down. The phrase "long day" immediately makes you picture someone feeling tired and frustrated. It's not just about the work itself, it's about how the person felt during the day. And when they say, "I was exhausted," it adds more weight to their experience. You weren't just tired, you were deeply tired. This is an example of how the language we use shows our emotions, and it's something you can learn to do with your own stories. At that moment, I realized something important. How you say something in English is just as important as what you say. If you simply said, "I was tired after work," it wouldn't give the same feeling. By using "long day" and "exhausted," the speaker adds a level of detail that helps you understand their experience more fully. It shows how you can communicate feelings more clearly, not just with the words themselves, but with the way you deliver them. This got me thinking about how I can talk about my own busy days. Instead of just saying, "I had a busy day," I started saying, "It was one of those days where everything felt like it was happening at once. By the time I was finished, I felt completely drained." This makes the conversation much richer and more engaging. It shows not only what happened, but also how I felt throughout the day. That's a much more interesting way to communicate. Another part of language learning that I think is often overlooked is the ability to tell a story. People don't just talk about facts, they tell stories. Whether it's a trip to the store or an exciting experience was terrible at it, which shows her initial struggle. Then she says, after a while I started getting better, which shows her progress. And finally, now I can make my favorite dishes without any problems, which expresses her current success. By telling this story, she took us on a journey of improvement. It wasn't just about cooking, it was about the process, the challenges, and the satisfaction of overcoming them. This made me realize something important. When you're learning English, it's not enough just to memorize vocabulary or grammar, rules. You need to learn how to tell your story in a way that connects with others. And the way you tell your story can depend on the details you include, the emotions you express, and how you organize your thoughts. If I told you I learned how to cook, and now I can cook well, it wouldn't have the same impact. But if I told you the story of how I struggled at first, how I kept practicing, and how I finally succeeded, you'd be much more interested. These kinds of real-life stories can teach you so much more than grammar rules. They show you how to make your language richer and more engaging. They also teach you how to structure your sentences in a way that tells a story. Just listen to any person talk about their life, and you'll see how they naturally organize their thoughts into beginning, middle, and end. Whether they're talking about a holiday, a personal challenge, or a funny incident, their story has a flow that keeps you interested. Let's take another example. I recently listened to a podcast where the speaker talked about their experience of traveling to a new city. They said, when I first arrived, I was overwhelmed by all the new sights and sounds. The streets were so busy, and I had to figure out how to get around. But after a few days, I started to feel more at home. I learned where the best coffee shops were, and I even made some new friends. This is a great example of how you can take a simple experience and turn it into an interesting story. The speaker starts by saying, when I first arrived, which sets the stage. They describe how they felt overwhelmed at first, and then they share how things improved as they got more comfortable. This shows a progression, which is key to making any story interesting. Instead of just saying, we traveled to a new city, they took us on a journey with them. They showed us how they felt, what they learned, and how their experience changed over time. This taught me something important. When you're talking about an experience, you don't have to make it sound perfect. In fact, the messier and more challenging the experience, the better your story can be. People love hearing about how you overcame difficulties, how you solved problems, or how you adapted to something new. Whether you're talking about traveling, learning a new skill, or facing challenges in life, the way you frame your story makes all the difference. Now, I'll share one more example that helped me understand the importance of language in expressing change. A few months ago, I had a conversation with a friend about how we both changed over the years. She said, I used to be really shy, but now I'm more confident. I think a lot of that comes from the experiences I've had, especially the ones that pushed me out of my comfort zone. What I noticed in this conversation is how my friend used the phrase used to be to show her past self, and now I'm to show the change. This is such a powerful way to describe transformation. She didn't just say, I'm confident now. She said, I used to be really shy, which gives context to her growth. It helps the listener understand not just where she is now, but how far she has come. This inspired me to think about how I talk about my own growth. Instead of just saying, I've become more confident, I started saying, I used to struggle with speaking in front of people, but now I can do it without feeling nervous. This gives the listener a clearer picture of where I started and how much I've changed. It also makes my story more relatable and encouraging to others who might be going through the same thing. When you listen to real-life stories like this, you begin to understand how to use language to talk about change and growth. You learn that language isn't just about describing the present, it's about showing how things have shifted over time, whether it's a personal challenge, a change in your career, or a new skill you've learned. Expressing the process of growth adds depth to your conversation. talking to a friend about how nervous I was to speak English, and he shared his own experience of how he got better at it. He said, "When I started learning English, I was terrified of making mistakes. But one day, I was having a conversation and I made a big mistake. I said, I go to the store yesterday. At first, I was embarrassed, but the person I was speaking to smiled and gently corrected me, saying, you meant I went to the store yesterday." I felt a little silly, but after that moment, I started realizing that it wasn't the mistake that mattered. It was how I kept going and learned from it. This story stuck with me. It helped me understand that making mistakes in English or in any language is just part of the process of learning. We all make mistakes, even native speakers. When you listen to real-life stories like this, you learn that communication is not about being perfect. It's about getting your message across and continuing to improve. And honestly, that's what makes the whole learning process fun. The more you put yourself out there and speak English, the more confident you become. I remember when I first started practicing with native speakers, I was so shy. But over time, I became more comfortable with making mistakes and trying new things. I started saying things like, "I didn't understand that. Can you say it again?" Or, "I'm still learning, so please be patient with me." People appreciate that honesty, and it actually makes conversations more natural. As I kept practicing, I began to notice how I was improving without even realizing it. I would listen to a podcast or watch a YouTube video, and I'd pick up on phrases or vocabulary that I hadn't noticed before. I remember hearing someone say, "I've been waiting for this moment for so long." The first time I heard it, I thought, wow, that sounds powerful. I want to use that in my own conversations. It wasn't just about understanding the words, it was about learning how to use them to express emotion and make a point. Here's another example. I was talking to a colleague who had just come back from a vacation. She said, "I had the most amazing time. I went to the beach every day and tried surfing for the first time. It was difficult at first, but by the end of the week I was catching waves. It was such an incredible experience." What really stood out to me about this conversation was how my colleague didn't just talk about what she did. She described how she felt, the challenges she faced, and how she overcame them. This made the story much more engaging and memorable. When you listen to people tell their stories like this, you learn how to connect with them on a deeper level. It's not just about the facts or the actions, it's about how those actions make us feel, what we learn from them, and how we grow. And it's a huge part of language learning. You're not just memorizing vocabulary, you're learning how to express your thoughts and emotions in a way that's meaningful to others. Speaking of learning, I've had some personal experiences that really helped me improve my English listening skills. One thing I did was watch TV shows in English without subtitles at first. It was hard at first because I missed a lot of words, but as I kept watching, I started picking up on patterns and common phrases. For example, in one show, the characters often said things like, "I can't believe this is happening," or "This is so crazy." I didn't understand everything at first, but I started to recognize these expressions and knew when to use them in my own conversations. But the key here is repetition. Repetition is so important in learning a language. When you hear a word or phrase over and over again, it starts to stick, and that's how you improve your listening skills. The more you listen, the more familiar the sounds and words become, and before you know it, you'll understand more of what's being said. I remember a time when I was listening to a podcast, and the host said something that made me laugh. He said, "I A story has the power to bring people together, to inspire them, and to make them think. That's why practicing storytelling in English is so valuable. You can tell stories about your life, your experiences, and the lessons you've learned along the way. And as you tell your story, you'll notice that your language skills improve. You'll get better at organizing your thoughts, using new vocabulary, and expressing yourself clearly. I can think of another example that helped me realize the importance of storytelling. I was talking to a friend about how I've gotten into teaching English, and I said, at first, I didn't think I would be a teacher. I was too shy, and I didn't feel confident enough. But then I started volunteering to teach English to beginners. I was nervous at first, but when I saw how excited my students were to learn, I felt a sense of pride. I realized that teaching English wasn't just about giving lessons, it was about helping others grow and feel confident in their ability to communicate. When I told this story, it wasn't just about explaining how I could become a teacher. It was about the emotions I felt, nervousness, pride, and the satisfaction of helping others. That's the magic of storytelling. You can turn a simple experience into something meaningful by adding emotion and context. And that's what makes learning English so exciting. It's not just about mastering vocabulary, it's about learning how to tell your story in a way that makes an impact. So when you're practicing English, think about the stories you want to tell. Think about the experiences in your life that have shaped you, the moments that have taught you something important, and the emotions you felt along the way. And then practice sharing those stories in English. The more you practice, the better you'll become at expressing yourself. You'll learn to communicate not just with words, but with the emotions and experiences that make you. I hope today's episode helped you see that learning English isn't just about memorizing words or rules. It's about expressing yourself, connecting with others, and sharing your story in a way that's meaningful. Remember, it's okay to make mistakes along the way. Each mistake is a step forward in your learning journey. The more you listen to real-life stories and practice speaking, the more confident you'll become in your ability to communicate in English. So keep pushing yourself, be patient, and enjoy the process. Every little improvement is worth celebrating. Thanks for joining me today on the English Pod community. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I can't wait to share more real-life stories and language tips with you in the next one. Keep practicing, keep learning, and remember, English is a journey, not a destination. Until next time, take care.